And we're back. Chapter 5, the last chapter in block 1. And, the book wisely is trying to integrate things across chapters. These are knockout mice and knockout babies, knockout mom and knockout babies. You don't know what you have at this point yet, but there's a nice discussion at the beginning of this chapter that deals with pregnant laboratory mice and the pups and how they turned out. Notice the chapter heading, catecholamines, which will be better defined in the chapter, but you may recognize this as one of the questions from the pretest. This name is common. They are closely chemically related neurotransmitters, which means drugs that affect one can affect others. And among friends, instead of naming them one by one, we can just say catecholamines. And the big ones for this chapter are really dopamine, DA, and norepinephrine, NE. As the book points out, epinephrine, also referred to as adrenaline. It's important, not so much to us, though, in this course. And there are synthetic pathways. Of course, you don't have to worry about the structures, plus it's an open book test. There's not a lot of, this is a fairly short chapter in one sense, but there are a lot of drugs, and a lot of the drugs are relevant to our clinical treatment of a number of conditions. So, you'll definitely see things in here that are relevant to either your life or the lives of others. So monoamines, we've already mentioned that before, one amine group. Adrenergic, noradrenergic, there's a discussion there about what terms are used, and it's a little bit sloppy, but I don't think you'll get confused. Noradrenergic, dopaminergic. Of course, the monoamine that I usually look for that is a monoamine but is not a catecholamine is serotonin, serotonergic. And serotonin will rear its head in this chapter. It is a monoamine. It's structurally somewhat related to these drugs, and sometimes drugs that affect the catecholamines will also affect serotonin. So the concept of rate limiting step is important. Again, I remember being your age, learning this stuff for the first time. It was drilled into our heads that it was important to know in the synthetic pathway for whatever it is we were dealing with, what was the rate limiting step. That's like the gas pedal. You've got a bunch of gas in the gas tank. You have an engine with way more power than you need right now, and you modulate your gas pedal to interact those two items to give you varying amounts of power under varying conditions. So that's a little bit like the rate limiting step in synthetic pathways. And the figure 5.2, we're going to see how these things are put together. And tyrosine hydroxylase is going to be very important, and it is the rate limiting enzyme in the pathway. And as we'll see on the next page, unfortunately we can't say it yet, that to produce norepinephrine, you have to first produce dopamine. So there's an indication of how tied together they are. Their synthetic pathway is shared. And we'll see that in just a second. And there's a lot of other things to look at here, but not worth me reading them to you. There we go. Tyrosine, an essential amino acid. Essential means you can't make it, you have to consume it. And sometimes we mess with tyrosine to affect catecholamine synthesis. Adding more of it doesn't do too much because it's not the rate limiting step. But if you run out of gas in your car, you can press on your gas pedal all you want and nothing very useful will happen. So reductions can have effects. So there's DOPA or L-DOPA, and L-DOPA shows up in this chapter quite a bit. It's of late, last couple decades, a common treatment for Parkinson's disease. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, I think in the last chapter, it doesn't treat the disorder. It's only symptomatic. It works for a while, but not forever. So there's tyrosine hydroxylase, which is catalyzing the conversion of tyrosine into L-DOPA. And if you look at these, if you care, if you like structure, you can see how things are being, constructed and sometimes deconstructed. There's the synthesis of dopamine, aromatic acid decarboxylase. And if that's all you want, you're done. But if you want to, you can use DBH, dopamine beta hydroxylase, and go on to norepinephrine. And you can even go beyond that, but we won't talk about it. There we go. Clinically, L-DOPA has been the primary therapeutic agent used in treating Parkinson's. Its impact is dramatic when it works. It's really, really dramatic. And now there's a discussion that you sort of saw in the chapter before, the preceding chapter about the story of neurotransmitters. They're stored and released from synaptic vesicles, and there are transporters and reserpine. It's not an earth-shattering drug now, but when I was reserpine research was very important, and it can mess with storage. And eventually we'll see a picture of storage vesicles. And if you can't store your neurotransmitter, maintenance comes and picks it up. One of my peers went to graduate school with maybe 2 years worth of data from running animals as an undergraduate at Scranton. He got to his dorm room at Binghamton University and left 2 years worth of papers in a cardboard box in the hallway, which means he did not store his neurotransmitter. And smiling and alert, maintenance crews, enzymatic degradation, came sweeping down the hall and did what they were supposed to do. You put stuff in the hall, you don't want it. They took it, and he lost you 2 years worth of data. So there's some classic work being discussed here. Carlson, very important person. Hello, Nobel Prize, 2000. And there's the terms of exocytosis comes up again, and there's amphetamine and methamphetamine. Certainly culturally relevant drugs, rarely used clinically, but the release of neurotransmitters affecting that can have a dramatic effect on animals. These animals here are catatonic, and they're almost hard to recognize as rabbits because their ears are down. So up here, reserpine, they have trouble storing monoamines, and tremendously sedated, and then you give them L-DOPA, and bam, they can be back really, really quickly. So that's a nice story. There's That's a synaptic vesicle. Remember, this is a bilipid layer, and 2 chapters ago, we saw, I believe, the glutamate vesicle. Very complex. Docking is important. If you want to relearn some of that stuff, you can go back there. Here's the synthetic pathway for dopamine and storage and release. These postsynaptic receptor sites, look like Looney Tunes things. They are metabotropic receptors, D1 and D2. So it's not far off of how they're really depicted. They are transmembrane, but they don't form channels. This dopamine transporter here is very important. Notice what it's doing. It's gobbling up. It's like Hungry Hippo, where you release, is that still a thing? You release your dopamine, and of course, it's supposed to hit these receptors, and there are different types, and it's complicated, but the dopamine tends not to be destroyed in the synaptic cleft. It tends to be reuptaken. Now, having been reuptaken, it can be destroyed at this point, or it can be put back in vesicles for later use. Here's a D2 autoreceptor, and autoreceptors were discussed in an earlier chapter, and I mentioned older people speaking with louder than normal voices because they don't hear themselves. Well, and here this terminal is listening to a self-released dopamine, and when it detects it's released enough, it dams it down. If you gave a drug that specifically targeted that receptor, and we've got them, you would be telling this presynaptic terminal, oh, geez, you're releasing a ton of dopamine, don't release any more, and that's what would happen. Now, down below, we had a chapter dealing with action potentials, and there we had the time base really spread out. You could see the little bumps and squiggles and presynaptic depolarization and hyperpolarization, and then the spike, and then the hyperpolarization after the spike. Well, here, for one thing, these recordings are extracellular, not inside the neuron as we saw earlier, but these recording electrodes are just sitting near electrodes, near neurons, and an action potential is big, and you can see them. And there's a discussion of patterning, and you can certainly see with the REM here that these cells are firing in clusters, and that's discussed up here with, we have single spike mode and burst mode, and you can see it. This was exciting stuff. I'm surprised that this is 2007. I would have expected these data to have come from a long time ago. But notice VTA. Now, when we were talking about anatomy in the midbrain, we saw the VTA, and I said it's going to be important. And one of the targets of the VTA will come up shortly. And VTA, the cells in there, one of the things they produce is dopamine, and they release it in different places. We'll see where that is in this chapter. Nucleus accumbens, I don't think I said, but I'll say it in this chapter. VTA and nucleus accumbens are involved in virtually all reward and addictive phenomena. When I say reward, I mean drugs and also natural rewards. VTA is very important, which is probably why this is so 2007, so recent, because they were picking apart the VTA. This is certainly not the first discovery of this. And they, it's tonic release and phasic release, and the words mean pretty much what English would indicate. Okay. So here we have a black image with white in it. These are noradrenergic fibers, not dopaminergic. And it is an antibody to DBH. So cells that have DBH, dopamine beta hydroxylase, are going to be tagged here. Now, earlier when we saw immunohistochemistry, we saw like a pale, like sheepskin, yellowy background with brown cells, kind of warm brown colors. That's with what's called a light field microscope. A light field microscope is the one you probably all used in high school. There's a light source below the base. The light source sends the light up through the tissue, goes through the tissue into the objective, into your eye, and it's a field of light. This, the microscope from 10 feet away, is going to look just the same, but it's a dark field microscope. A dark field microscope has a special condenser below the stage, and it produces light that goes in a cone-shaped fashion through the tissue you're looking at, and if nothing messes with the light, none of it hits the objective. It just goes off into space. Therefore, you have a dark field. However, if there's something in your tissue, and this is used a lot for autoradiography where you have silver grains in there, silver is very reflective, or that brown stain we saw earlier, it has reflective properties. And when the cone of light is trying to go through there, just minding its business and not trying to get into the objective, the crystals on that reaction product deflect some of the light. And some of the light goes this way and that way, and some of it goes up through the objective. And now what you have is a dark field with shiny spots. And here we're trying to show that there are varicosities along the lengths of the fibers. What does that mean? Varicosities are little swellings. And I'm trying to find good examples here, but there's a swelling here, and then it gets a little thin, and there's a swelling there, and there's a swelling there. And oh, here we go. There's a nice swelling there, and a swelling there, and then not much, and then a swelling. So what that means is these endings are not the classic endings you saw as the simplified neuron. The first time we showed you a multipolar neuron where everything comes out the terminal. It's as if your arms, like you're an octopus. Yeah, that's it. You're an octopus, and those swellings along the arm of the octopus, they are making synaptic contacts all along where the arm goes. So norepinephrine, in this case, is being released in all these places, which means its effects are not going to be very precise. They're pretty widespread. So it's important to appreciate dark field. Again, light field, normal microscopy, you shoot the light like a flashlight right through the tissue, and you get a white field. Dark field, you set up a cone of light that is designed very precisely to not go into your objective unless there's little mirrors in your tissue, and then you see stuff. By the way, a mother's eye, which is in this case me, can see these dark areas. See these big dark areas? There's a dark area here. There's a big dark area here. Then it kind of goes off in this direction, and then there's a mess, and then, oh, there's a dark area there, and it goes up to the right. What the heck are those dark areas? For 30 years of my research experience, I didn't even see those. But then I became obsessed with prenatal exercise and neurogenesis, which means the development of new neurons. And if you're going to grow new neurons, you need new blood vessels. And so I started seeing what was always in my tissue, but I never saw it, blood vessels. I'm telling you that if I had access to this tissue and I could check this more carefully, these are blood vessels. And isn't it interesting, particularly this one, Are you telling me that norepinephrine isn't systematically being released onto that blood vessel or this blood vessel, or it's something's going on there? I don't know what it is. Somebody must, but boy, there's no mistaking it. Those black areas again are blood vessels, and norepinephrine is being bled along the capillary. There's a nice opiates keep coming up in this book. I'm an opiate guy. Morphine addiction, and there's a very nice discussion of norepinephrine interaction. I'm sorry, dopamine interaction with norepinephrine with opiate withdrawal, and clonidine and yohimbine are discussed there. It's a very nice little story, and this book seems obsessed with. Well, we'll see yohimbine later. I thought it was here. The morphine withdrawal. It's complicated, and panic disorder. I mean, these drugs are really, really relevant to a lot of very important things. Yohimbine induces anxiety. Oh yeah, in some people it can really trigger anxiety to the point of a panic attack. So catecholamine inactivation occurs through a combination of reuptake, and we already saw the dopamine transporter in that original figure, and metabolism, which is breakdown. And there's yohimbine again, and opiate withdrawal. It says opioid. Remember, I prefer the term opioid when you're dealing with exogenous drugs. So you have dopamine transporters and norepinephrine transporters, and you mess with those, and you mess with turning off the neurotransmitters. And there are those the neurotransmitter, as I highlighted, the neurotransmitter transporters differ from autoreceptors discussed earlier. Oh yeah, they're different. Autoreceptors are ears. Autoreceptors listen. Transporters transport. I almost feel this goes without saying. So your ears do not transport vibrating air into your head. They respond to vibrating air. Your mouth is a transporter. There you're sucking air in. Very different. Tricyclic drugs, you can guess that their name has something to do with their structure. There's 3 cycles. And here they don't say tricyclic drugs, they say tricyclic antidepressants. Before we had more modern antidepressants, these were commonly used. And they still are used sometimes today. They have somewhat more problematic side effects. They are not very specific. For a while, we were obsessed with specificity of antidepressant drugs, but now we realize that we want to mix it up a bit and not just affect one neurotransmitter. Cocaine. Another important transporter blocking drug is cocaine, which inhibits the reuptake of all 3 major monoamines: dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin. Bam. And a graduate of the University of Scranton characterized, that is, discovered, was involved in discovering the cocaine transporter mechanism. Or how cocaine worked on the transporter mechanism. This is important stuff, and cocaine is an atomic bomb of a drug. It is not to be trifled with. I mean, look at all the things it affects. Reuptake can quickly terminate. When I talk about neurotransmission and I think about quick, I do not think about reuptake. I think about acetylcholinesterase, which comes in a later chapter, which is an enzyme that destroys acetylcholine in the synaptic cleft. Bam, that's fast. And that is usually associated with ionotropic receptors. And it was discussed in the book that metabotropic receptors, which tend to be slower, are associated with slower deactivation, and that's more like reuptake. So it's not painfully slow, but it's not blindingly fast either. And then you got catechol methyltransferase, COMT, and MAO. Those are both really important. And MAO inhibitors, MAOIs were used and are used as antidepressant drugs, as were the tricyclics. And there's a discussion there of A and B and who does what and COMT and who does what. Breakdown products. Once you take your neurotransmitter and break it down, it turns into other things, which are usually not active in the neurotransmitter system, but they ooze out, they get into the extracellular space, they get into blood vessels, they are transported, and we can assay them and get an idea of activity of monoamines, catecholamines, and serotonin in the brain through the breakdown products, which is alluded to there. And there's MAOIs. Now, I said MAOIs, they spelled out inhibitor, but they're mostly referred to as MAOIs. And there's some of them, and long used for the treatment of clinical depression. We're never going to get to chapter 8, but we're dealing with depression right now. There's some drugs that are more specific than the classic MAOIs, and you may know some of these. So we have MAOIs and MAOB inhibitors, and Parkinson's. We've mentioned L-DOPA for Parkinson's, but of course, if you can start not breaking down the dopamine you have in your brain, that's going to be good for Parkinson patients. Okay, and then there's the summary. Okay, now we're dealing with the anatomy, and I just love this anatomy. Modern neuroanatomy is done with antibodies, and you saw that earlier, and I didn't have much to say about it because I don't do it. But this traditional work on dopamine, norepinephrine, and actually serotonin, Dahlstrom and Fuchs, they used formaldehyde gas, and they got the monoamines to directly fluoresce. So they were not looking at an antibody that was attached to something, and it probably was serotonin. They were looking at serotonin fluorescing. And they were the first kids on the block to have this technology, and they knew it was important, and they decided to map it, and they tried to make themselves blank slates. Most cell groups in the nervous system were named using basic stains that were around, for like 100 years before Dahlstrom and Fuchs came along. And they were based on what cell groups looked like and what the cells in the cell groups looked like. And they didn't want to be contaminated by that. They wanted to tell the story of these things that they were the first to be able to see, and they tried to turn themselves into blank slates. I know what's here. I'm a neuroanatomist, but I just wanted to talk about those glowing cells in my microscope right now. And they named them and numbered them. And the discussion is there. So you have A1 to A7, norepinephrine, A8 to A16, dopaminergic. There's also serotonin. And no surprise, what they named with their new system largely agreed with existing nomenclature. As I said before, neurons that look different act differently. And if you're using a different neurotransmitter as your neurotransmitter, you probably have a different function. And so the old techniques from Cajal and before, were prescient. They knew things before we knew that there were things to know. They just, on faith, assumed that structure was important and that structure was related to function, and they were right. And here's two that we've seen before, substantia nigra, and you should remember why it's called substantia nigra, which has nothing to do with Dahlstrom and Fuchs and the Swedish system. It's because it's a part of the brain. You don't even have to stain it. You just cut through there with a knife, and it's black. It's substantia nigra. And you may recall, and we'll see it briefly shortly in this chapter, that there was another area that when they cut through it, it didn't look black, it looked blue. And there's a certain blue, cerulean blue, and that will be coming up shortly. Now, the VTA, the ventral tegmental area, I've already mentioned in this chapter. Both of these use dopamine as their primary neurotransmitter, and now we're going to see where they go. By the way, caudate putamen, this will come up later, and you've already seen a picture of this stained in an earlier chapter when they were showing you an immuno. And we're back. The ventral tegmental area, as I mentioned earlier, is anatomically named. It's below other things. It's pretty low. It's ventral. It's ventral to the substantia nigra. In sharks, you have the dorsal fin, which is on the back. The other surface is ventral. So as you move towards your chest or away from your back, you're moving ventrally. The tegmentum is part of the midbrain, the mesencephalon, and both of these contain dopamine. And we're about to see some good anatomy here. There's Kapoor, which you've already dealt with. And here's, okay, I made it in red because this may be the first time the book has clearly said this term. Nucleus accumbens, which is down here, really, really important to reward and addiction. And the connection between the VTA and the accumbens is critical. And then there's a little mentioning here of how we name things in the brain. Nigrostriatal. So you usually name things based on where it starts and where it ends. And the nigrostriatal starts in the substantia nigra and goes to the striatum, Kapoor, and then the mesolimbic goes from, that's a little more diffused from the midbrain to limbic system structures. We have a spinal thalamic tract. You can guess that begins in the spinal cord and ends in the thalamus. So they all pretty much make sense. So here's A9, substantia nigra. It's pretty robust unless you have Parkinson's disease. And here's a fairly discrete pathway. And globus pallidus is part of this of the substantia, the target area of this. And then there's our friend Kapoor, and we'll see pictures of that shortly. So basically, these are the majority structures of the basal ganglia up here, which, by the way, many people include the substantia nigra as part of that. But there's the nigrostriatal pathway. And then you have the mesolimbic pathway, which is also A10. Nobody speaks in A10s and A9s because all that effort that Dahlstrom and Fuchs did, we already knew the names of the structures. We just didn't know what the chemistry was. The olfactory tubercle You may remember in an earlier chapter, the book was obsessed with D2 receptors and prolactin levels treating schizophrenia. Well, that's the pathway that's related to that. But in terms of reward and addiction, accumbens is where it's happening. And then A10 also goes to a number of other places. Hippocampus is very important for memory, spatial memory, Morris Water maze, radial arm maze, cerebral cortex, septum, all. I don't know if we're going to see the septum in this chapter, but it's important. The first lesion I ever did to an animal was supposed to be in the septal region. I said in the old days, I would stick an electrode in the brain and just destroy it with electricity. Now we use more specific mechanisms like neurotoxins, and some of those are discussed on the next page, not the next page, but there's a whole box here talking about mutations, and it's definitely worth looking at. It's big, lots of talking. So what's neat about this, by the way, is this is from a human. So dopamine release from a real human. They must have harvested some tissue. So this is pretty bleeding edge, and it's important. And I leave it to you to look at the boxes. I want to get back to neuroanatomy. Okay, 6-OHDA, I think I've done that one. MPTP, I don't think I've used that one. But these can fairly specifically kill dopamine neurons. You still stick a cannula in the brain typically and inject the material where the cell bodies are, but it works quite well. So we saw a picture like this earlier. So it's immunohistochemistry. It's 6-OHDA lesion of the medial forebrain bundle. Has that term been talked about before? So that bundle of fibers that we saw coming up from the midbrain, that was largely the medial forebrain bundle. And they lesioned with 6-OHDA axons in the medial forebrain bundle. And what that did was it destroyed axons. This is not a cross pathway, it's on the same side. It really nailed the striatum on the lesion side. By the way, this is the septal region here, and you can see that that's not nailed. Earlier, I realized I mentioned, I sort of completed the thought that we were looking at staining of tissue similar to this, and I said, notice the white dots, those are axons, and there the axons are much clearer. It's not important what they are, so I'll try to inhibit and not say it. So that's impressive. And by the way, this is the kind of tissue you can do dark field on if you want to. This is so dramatic, you don't need to go into anything special to do that. So then, they're talking about dopamine deficient and lesions, and then we have injections of L-DOPA. And an injection of L-DOPA, of course, bypasses the tryptophan hydroxylase, directly goes from L-DOPA to dopamine and minutes until it wears off. And again, people with Parkinson's disease, L-DOPA can work that fast. PFC, prefrontal cortex. Schizophrenia is complex, to put it simply. More than one neurotransmitter is important. Historically, dopamine has been primary focus, but we'll see other areas related to that. But dopamine hypoactivity in the prefrontal could underlie some of the cognitive deficits in patients with schizophrenia. Yeah, certainly could. And we're going to see glutamate in there later. And here's dopamine-specific parts of the nucleus accumbens. And again, you should always, reflexively say VTA nucleus accumbens. And both of these areas are sort of complex. And this figure, they are splitting apart different parts of the VTA. And in one part is dealing with reward, and the other part is dealing with aversion. Now, we haven't said much about aversion, but let me point out that there's a new part of the brain in town here, the lateral habenula. And why do I like that? The habenular complex, suggesting it's complicated, is not very big. That blob gives it way too much area. But the lateral, the habenuloid complex is very related to the periaqueductal gray, which I've already mentioned. It's the gray area around the cerebral aqueduct. And it's involved in a lot of things. And here, there's an aversion pathway. Notice the medial prefrontal cortex. So this is important and could be important for schizophrenia. Okay. We've seen these guys before. So these are metabotropic receptors, and you've got G proteins, and notice that there are different kinds of G proteins here. And you have the adenyl cyclase doing its thing, and one G protein is exciting it, and one is inhibiting it. Very complicated. And remember that these kind of interactions take time. This is not fast because the dopamine or the dopamine agonist has to hit the external part of the transmembrane complex, which is the metabotropic, and then that has to notice it and shift and release the chemicals which float in the inner side of the bilipid layer until it runs into adenyl cyclase, which does stuff, and then that has to float around. This isn't fast, but it lasts a long time. And that's what I want you to think about when you differentiate between metabotropic and ionotropic receptor systems. And apomorphine is used for some of this research. Widely used agonist that stimulates D1 and D2, but different doses have different levels, different amounts of impact. And Viagra comes up again because we're dealing with second messenger systems here. And I highlighted this only not because I'm overly interested in the drug. It's most commonly used agonist for D1 receptors is SKF 38393. That's not very humane. But SKF means Smith, Kline, and French. So it's the name of the manufacturer. And then that huge number probably just indicates how they keep track of drugs. They keep cracking them out, and the preceding drug was 92, and then 93, and then 94. And catalepsy comes up again. There's a juvenile rat. That's a common measure of catalepsy. It's like a hitching post, and you put the animal up on the hitching post, and 10-day-old rat pup, and it's subcutaneous. Haloperidol, which is important for treatment of schizophrenia. And I mentioned the fact that some classic traditional anti-schizophrenic drugs can make you a bit like a zombie. And if you're a wealthy schizophrenic, they tend to not overdose you. But if you're a poor schizophrenic in an out clinic or something, they're going to probably give you more of the drug than you absolutely need, and you may be set out into the city a little zombied up. There was a place in Scranton where they had a lot of children, particularly the males, who were annoying. They got a local psychiatrist to diagnose them with childhood schizophrenia, and they got to give them these kinds of drugs. And then they weren't much trouble anymore because they didn't run around; they kind of lurched around. Um, so there's catalepsy, haloperidol, uh, drugs that you take for a while. You can get supersensitivity, and one of the ways to get supersensitivity or hyposensitivity is at the bottom receptor upregulation. The brain is always watching, and you start blocking its receptors for something, and it says something's up here. I'm not getting as many messages as I used to get. So you grow more receptors, and then if they are unleashed, you get hypersensitivity. Um, Knockout mice, again, hyperactivity. Just take a look at that. I can't really add to that discussion. This is in the box. I don't really want to talk about the overall issue, but this sub-issue is important. Mice overexpressing D2 receptors have been proposed to be the partial animal model of schizophrenia. Time will tell how that works out. But they're always looking. They're always looking. And these new molecular genetic things are really important. And here are the mutant animals being exposed to a drug that usually creates a great deal of physical activity, cocaine. Not if you're a knockout. Lots of drugs. Aren't you glad this is an open book test? But there's a summary of a lot of things that we've seen so far. There's haloperidol, and there's reserpine, and AMPT, 6-OHDA. So it's a nice summary. I don't think there's anything new in that table. And now we do norepinephrine. And I remind you again that substantia nigra is called substantia nigra because when you cut through a fresh brain, that part of the brain looks black. And this is more subtle, but when you cut through this part of the brain, you see a little blue patch. Actually, two of them, the same as substantia nigra, one on the left and one on the right. We have an elegant name for a type of blue, cerulean blue, and thus the name locus coeruleus. These are kind of ugly scans showing you very difficult to see, but just above each yellow arrow, there's a little white spot. Those are your left and right locus coeruleus. They're not big, and they don't have a ton of neurons. And the number of neurons in there decrease as you age. And there's some indications that our rule against letting people under 35 that they can't become president of the United States. That might not be a bad idea because when you hit 35 and beyond, you've lost some of those guys, and you're calmer, and you're less likely to do impulsive things. So there it is in the rat. So there are the cells of the locus coeruleus, which is A6, and look at where they go. And a better question is, where don't they go? They're going everywhere, and they're pounding into your olfactory bulbs. Now in us, that's probably not very important, but remember how relatively giant olfactory bulbs are for us. And they're going to interact with a lot of things, as we'll see. Um, but you blow up the locus coeruleus on both sides, and you pretty much nailed virtually all the norepinephrine we have. Oh, one thing I didn't mention is notice that norepinephrine is heading down to the spinal cord, which no doubt is important for some elements of pain inhibition. When I was stimulating the brain, I was working in this area, and the non-opioid stress-induced analgesia was from up here. Ew, look, I could have been stimulating the ends of these axons, backfiring them, and then having branching lead to things going down the spinal cord. But let's not think about that. And oh, okay, there's Cannon. That's not me. That's Walter B. He's the famous Cannon. When I first got to Scranton 40 years ago, then the Soviet Union, for some reason, they were obsessed with him. And I used to get requests for reprints all the time because they thought I was the famous Cannon, but the famous Cannon was already dead. Walter B. He looks like a nice guy. So alpha and beta norepinephrine or adrenergic receptors. There was an article on Facebook that's relevant to this, and I regret that I didn't pay much attention to it. But we'll see that there are therapeutic drugs that work on these systems. Every once in a while this happens. There we go. So where are they? They're like everywhere. Cerebral cortex, thalamus, hypothalamus, cerebellum, various limbic structures, hippocampus and amygdala. Man, these are the big names. These are the most important areas. It goes everywhere important. And then alpha 2 are located in the locus coeruleus and elsewhere, so they're going to be involved in negative feedback, autoreceptors, and then like dopamine D1s, there's parallels in terms of how they affect the neurotransmitter. Notice that there's another type of mechanism used by receptors of the alpha 1 subtype. These receptors operate through the phosphoinositide second messenger system, which leads to increased concentration of free calcium within the postsynaptic cell. And you may remember that calcium entering a cell can cause second messenger effects. And if it's a terminal, it's going to be involved in neurotransmitter release. Okay, a large body of literature has demonstrated that the locus coeruleus norepinephrine neurons and activation of adrenergic receptors in the forebrain are important for behavioral and electrophysiological arousal, so alertness. And in an earlier version of this book, there was a nice little graphic of a mouse taking a nap, and the cells were not very active, and then the neurons fired up, and the animal became vigilant. And one thing that worries me about drugs that are agonists for catecholamines, which includes dopamine, is they make people hypervigilant and kind of paranoid. And in a society where guns are cheap and plentiful, having hypervigilant, paranoid, often male people running around on drugs that ramp up cholinergic activity is not a good idea. There's orexin again, and norepinephrine, and arousal. And as we'll see, as you'll see when you read to the bottom of this section, it's complicated. They definitely do interact. They are involved in modulating between wakefulness and not, but it's not as simple as you would like. And there's another diagram with data that are relevant. This is very important. The relationship between norepinephrine release in the prefrontal cortex and cognitive functioning can be described as an inverted U-shaped function in which the optimal amount of arousal is not too low and not too high. The inverted U, we've known about that for decades in terms of optimal levels of arousal. You want to be in the sweet spot. And now we can point to norepinephrine as being important for putting us in that sweet spot. And we have drugs that can affect working memory. And remember, with the radiolarm maze, we had working memory and reference memory. And there's also different behavioral tests that can specifically look at working. But in the radiolarm maze, working memory means I've already gone down this lane. I don't need to go do it again. This is not using that. This is a delay period, more like that monkey picture. Oh, it is rhesus monkeys. So this is that picture from before on the behavioral chapter. And you can see that there's a sweet spot for improving memory. And there's the inverted U. So low arousal, you're basically napping. High arousal, you're out of control. And in the middle, you're at optimum performance. This is very important for athletes, obviously, but also for the rest of us. And again, if you go into an exam out of your mind stressed, that is not going to do anything good for your ability to think. So you want to train for exams, self-testing, so that you stay, in your practicing environment in a situation that's similar to your testing environment. Testing for this class should not be very stressful since you already know the questions and the book is open. So that's passive avoidance. This is a behavioral test that I don't think came up in the chapter on testing. It's a classic. Why do people like it? Not because it's passive, but because you often can produce learning in one trial. So you don't have to do test, and then next week find out something. You take an animal right off the shelf, put them in this situation. They have one experience. They don't need another, and they can show that they've learned something after that singular experience. And I think on the next page we have yes. So dark light, that was discussed earlier. Animals do or don't like being in the light. Not very much. They would rather than be in the dark. So usually the default is the light is the safe area. So in other words, you want them to go against their gentle, natural tendencies to stay there. But they're in the light compartment. They see a dark hole in a wall and they think, oh, cool, I'll go in there. And you go in there and you get a shock. And they're no fool. After one exposure to that, when you put them in there again, their latency to go into the dark area will now be increased. And that's what's measured. And oh boy, I'm hitting the wrong button over here. Vagus nerve. Boy, is this important to a lot of things. And there's a suggestion that, we know there are beta receptors on the vagus nerve, and that could affect things. But, and I'm not saying that's not true. It's just, I was just excited to see the vagus nerve because it's something you should think about. But here's something we tend to not think about. and that's blood glucose. And blood glucose or glucose is the primary metabolic resource for the brain. And if you do something that increases circulating levels of glucose, that pops right through the blood-brain barrier, and that can help memory. I used to recommend, and I guess I recommend to you too. I recommend sugary snacks during exams. I think they can help you. Of course, if you react badly to sugary snacks, don't do that. And there was just a discussion there about crossing the blood-brain barrier. So, asthma. Beta receptor stimulation leads to relaxation of the bronchial muscles, thereby providing a wider airway. You know what else relaxes bronchial muscles? Smoke. No, bitter. A bitter taste, which is often associated with smoke. They've been doing some research where you inhale a bitter taste, and there are bitter taste receptors in your lungs, and they also cause bronchial dilation. So this is a therapeutic drug, Precedex, alpha-2 agonist, sedation, anxiolytic, which means anti-anxiety, analgesic, pain-inhibiting, surgical patients in the intensive care unit. And as I think it points out, the notice it says pain inhibition. And remember the picture of the locus coeruleus and those mystery blue fibers sort of disappearing into the spinal cord. That may be related to that. And here's a summary of receptor subtypes, alpha and beta, and what they do for a living, even fat tissue, and your iris, pupil dilation. Nothing new there, but worth looking at. Hypertension treatments, they're important. A lot of people are on beta blockers. Beta blockers do not alleviate anxiety, but instead they help the patient feel better by reducing some symptoms of the disorder. And boy, it was a New York Times article, and the person was writing that beta blockers help them get over their stage fright. And then there's a million drugs. And I believe we have reached the end of this story, yes. So this chapter has a blizzard of drugs. Again, it's open book, so that should alleviate your problems. I'm going to take the questions out of these primarily, or all right, all of them out of these 22 study questions. So I don't think you'll find that it's overly challenging. I hope. Don't get stressed. You may need beta blockers.